The seeker stands before an ancient emblem carved into stone weathered by centuries, a double-headed eagle. Wings spread in sovereign dominion, each head gazing in opposite directions. This is no mere decorative flourish of empire or fraternal order. It is a declaration encoded in symbol, a philosophical thesis written in the language of image that precedes all words. The double-headed eagle appears across civilizations, separated by vast distances and epochs, from the Byzantine Empire to the Holy Roman Empire, from Masonic lodges to alchemical manuscripts, from the standards of the Hittites to the modern flags of nations. This ubiquity suggests something deeper than political propaganda or aesthetic preference. It points toward a recognition of a fundamental structure within consciousness itself, a geometry of the psyche that different traditions have independently intuited and attempted to capture. Why does this symbol persist? What truth does it guard that survives the collapse of empires and the erosion of dogmas? The answer lies not in historical continuity, but in psychological necessity. The double-headed eagle represents the sentinel of an inner axis, the vertical pole around which the chaotic material of selfhood must organize itself if it is to achieve coherence rather than fragmentation. The modern individual, cut adrift from traditional cosmologies and collective myths, finds themselves in a peculiar predicament. They possess unprecedented freedom to construct their own meaning, yet this very freedom often manifests as paralysis, anxiety, and the haunting sense of incompleteness. The alchemists called this state the massa confusa, the confused matter that must be worked upon. Jung termed it the condition of the dissociated psyche, where conscious intention and unconscious impulse war against one another in destructive patterns. The double-headed eagle offers a diagram for navigation through this crisis. It speaks of a sovereignty that is not imposed from without, but cultivated from within, a royalty of consciousness that does not deny the shadow or flee from the depths, but integrates them through deliberate work. This is the science of inner alchemy, not the literal transmutation of base metals into gold, but the psychological transmutation of fragmented drives into unified purpose, of reactive existence into conscious being. The journey toward this integration begins with a simple recognition that you are divided. The eagle's two heads represent this division made explicit, acknowledged, and thereby rendered workable. One cannot heal what one refuses to see. The alchemical tradition, beneath its veils of obscure symbolism and deliberate encryption, was never primarily concerned with material transformation. The laboratory, the furnace, the vessels, the operations upon physical substances, these served as both cover story and pedagogical method. The true laboratory was the psyche. The true vessel was consciousness itself. The true fire was directed attention sustained over time, despite resistance and distraction. At the heart of alchemical doctrine stands the axiom of solve et coagula, dissolve and coagulate. This principle describes a rhythmic process, the breaking down of fixed structures that have become rigid and lifeless, followed by the reconstitution of elements into new configurations that possess greater vitality and coherence. Applied psychologically, this becomes the work of dissolving calcified self-images, inherited beliefs that no longer serve, and defensive patterns that protect a smaller version of who one might become. The coagulation phase represents the deliberate construction of a more authentic self-structure, one forged from conscious choice rather than unconscious inheritance. The double-headed eagle embodies this dynamic tension. Its two heads do not represent mere dualities, not simply conscious and unconscious, reason and emotion, masculine and feminine. Rather, they represent the capacity to hold opposites in awareness simultaneously without collapsing into one pole or the other. This is what Jung called the transcendent function, the psyche's ability to generate a third position that is neither thesis nor antithesis, but a synthesis that preserves and transforms both. One head of the eagle gazes toward the manifest world, the realm of matter, action, consequence, and external achievement. This is the solar principle, associated with consciousness, discrimination, order, and the heroic ego that ventures forth to shape reality according to will. The other head gazes toward the hidden world, the realm of potential, image, dream, and interior depth. This is the lunar principle, associated with the unconscious, reception, dissolution, and the reflective capacity that perceives meaning beneath surface appearance. Most human suffering arises from the warfare between these two orientations. The person who identifies solely with the solar head becomes brittle, driven, unable to rest or receive. They achieve external success while experiencing internal desolation. Conversely, the person who identifies solely with the lunar head becomes passive, lost in fantasy, unable to actualize potential into form. They experience rich inner life while remaining ineffectual in the world. The alchemists understood that genuine transformation required the reconciliation of these opposites through a third element they called mercurius, not the metal mercury, but the psychological capacity for fluidity, for movement between states without fixation in either. Mercurius is the trickster, the mediator, the substance that is simultaneously solid, liquid, and vapor. In Jungian terms, this corresponds to the individuating ego that can navigate between conscious intention and unconscious material without being destroyed by either. The eagle's body represents this unified center, the axis from which both heads emerge. This is the self in Jung's topology, not the everyday ego with its preferences and aversions, but the deeper organizing principle that orchestrates the totality of the psyche. The self is both the ground of consciousness and its telos, its aimed-at destination. We emerge from it in fragmented form. We return to it through integration. But here the tradition becomes ruthlessly practical. This axis does not exist as a given. It must be constructed through sustained effort. The double-headed eagle is not a description of what you are, but a blueprint for what you might become through deliberate work. You are born as the massa confusa, the warring multiplicity. The unified field of awareness represented by the eagle is an achievement, not an inheritance. This is the secret teaching beneath the symbol. Sovereignty over oneself is possible, but it demands a specific science, a methodical engagement with the full spectrum of one's being. The alchemist called their work the opus magnum, the great work. Jung called it individuation. Both point toward the same process, the systematic investigation of one's own depths, the integration of what has been rejected, the cultivation of capacities that have atrophied, and the construction of an internal authority that does not tyrannize, but liberates. The double-headed eagle thus stands as guardian of this teaching. It asks, are you willing to see with both eyes simultaneously? Are you capable of holding the tension between what you wish to be and what you actually are? Can you sustain the fire of self-examination without fleeing into distraction or collapsing into despair? The alchemical texts describe the great work as proceeding through distinct phases, each marked by color symbolism and archetypal imagery. These were not arbitrary inventions, but careful observations of the psychological stages through which consciousness passes during genuine transformation. The double-headed eagle appears most prominently in the latter stages of this journey, suggesting that the capacity for dual awareness emerges only after considerable preparatory work. Nigredo, the blackening. The work begins in darkness. This is the phase of Nigredo, the blackening characterized by depression, disillusionment, and the collapse of previous certainties. The seeker enters this stage involuntarily, through crisis, loss, or the simple erosion of naive beliefs about self and world. Everything that once seemed solid reveals itself as constructed, contingent, possibly false. Jung observed that this descent into darkness often manifests as what he termed the confrontation with the shadow, those aspects of one's own character that have been denied, repressed, or projected onto others. The shadow contains not only the morally unacceptable, but also undeveloped potentials, creative energies that were sacrificed to social conformity or parental expectation. During Nigredo, the person experiences themselves as worse than they imagined. The carefully curated self-image maintained for public consumption reveals itself as partial fiction. One discovers capacities for pettiness, cruelty, cowardice, and self-deception that contradict cherished narratives of personal goodness. This is mortifying, literally a small death of the ego's inflated self-conception. The alchemists spoke of the putrefactio, the putrefaction, wherein the old matter must rot and decompose before new life can emerge. Psychologically, this means allowing cherished identifications to die. The person who defined themselves through career success must face the emptiness beneath achievement. The person who maintained identity through relationships must encounter their capacity for solitude. The person who lived through intellectual mastery must experience the limits of reason. Crucially, this is not a stage to be rushed through or bypassed through spiritual bypassing. The temptation to leap into premature integration, to declare oneself healed before the wound has been properly examined, results in false synthesis. The Nigredo demands full descent. One must touch bottom. Albedo, the whitening. From the depths of blackening emerges the first light. The phase of albedo, the whitening, represents purification and clarification. Having confronted the shadow, the psyche begins to establish new discriminations. Not the rigid categories of the naive ego, but more nuanced distinctions between what genuinely serves growth and what merely perpetuates familiar suffering. Jung associated this stage with the integration of the anima in men, or animus in women, the contrasexual dimension of the psyche that balances and completes one's conscious orientation. For the man overly identified with rational control, this means encountering and integrating feeling, intuition, and receptivity. For the woman overly identified with relationship and adaptation, this means encountering and integrating assertion, discrimination, and autonomy. The albedo is symbolized by the lunar consciousness, reflective, receptive, concerned with interior states and subtle perceptions. This is where genuine psychological awareness begins. The person learns to observe their own reactions without being entirely consumed by them. A space opens between stimulus and response, between emotion and action. This space is the beginning of freedom. Here, one head of the double-headed eagle begins to awaken. The capacity for introspection, for witnessing one's own processes develops, but danger lurks in this stage. The fascination with interior exploration can become its own prison. Some seekers become permanent residents of the albedo, endlessly analyzing but never actualizing, reflecting but never acting, understanding patterns without breaking them. Citrinitas, the yellowing. The phase of Citrinitas, the yellowing, represents the dawning of solar consciousness, the awakening of will, purpose, and directed action informed by, but not paralyzed by, self-knowledge. Here, the second head of the eagle opens its eye. Jung often collapsed this stage into the final Rubedo, but some traditions preserve it as distinct, emphasizing the crucial transition from passive awareness to active engagement. The person who has descended into darkness and emerged with self-knowledge now faces the question, what will I do with this understanding? This is the stage of vocation in the deepest sense, not merely career, but the discovery of what Jung called one's myth, the organizing narrative that gives coherent meaning to individual existence. It is not imposed from without nor arbitrarily chosen, but recognized as having always been implicit in the pattern of one's life, waiting for conscious acknowledgement. The yellowing is characterized by the solar qualities, clarity of vision, strength of purpose, courage to act in alignment with authentic values rather than borrowed scripts. Yet because it follows the albedo's deep introspection, this solar energy is tempered, made wise rather than merely aggressive. It is the warrior who has learned when not to fight, the leader who has learned when to follow, the speaker who has learned when to remain silent. The tension between the two heads of the eagle becomes fully conscious here. One head holds the hard-won self-knowledge from the descent. The other head surveys the external landscape and demands engagement. How does one act in the world while remaining true to interior depths? How does one pursue goals without abandoning self-honesty? How does one exert will without falling back into ego inflation? Rubedo, the reddening. The final stage, Rubedo, the reddening, represents the full integration symbolized by the double-headed eagle in its complete form. The solar and lunar, active and receptive, external and internal, conscious and unconscious, these no longer war against each other, but operate in dynamic coordination. The alchemists called the product of this stage the philosopher's stone or the lapis philosophorum, not a physical object, but a condition of consciousness characterized by paradox held without resolution. The philosopher's stone is described as simultaneously solid and fluid, heavy and light, fixed and volatile. It is the stone that is not a stone, the ultimate riddle pointing toward a state of being that transcends ordinary categorical thinking. Jung identified this with the realized self, the totality of the psyche functioning in integrated wholeness. But he was careful to emphasize that this is never a final achievement, but an ongoing dynamic process. Integration is not a state one reaches and then maintains effortlessly. It is a continuous practice of returning to center, of re-establishing the axis when one inevitably loses it. The double-headed eagle at this stage represents what might be called binocular consciousness, the ability to see simultaneously from multiple perspectives without losing coherence. One can engage fully in action while maintaining awareness of the action's limits and potential shadows. One can commit to relationships while preserving autonomy. One can hold strong convictions while remaining genuinely open to being wrong. This is the science of inner royalty, not the tyranny of ego ruling over the rest of the psyche through repression, but the sovereignty of integrated awareness that includes all aspects of being in conscious relationship. The king or queen at the center of the alchemical mandala is the individuated self that has earned authority through the complete journey, not through force, but through recognition. The journey through these stages is not linear but spiral. One returns to Nigredo at deeper levels, discovers new dimensions requiring Albedo's reflection, actuates new capacities in Citrinitas, and achieves temporary Rubedo before the cycle recommences. Each iteration, however, occurs from a more stable center, with greater capacity to navigate the phases without being destroyed by them. There comes a moment in the alchemical process, unavoidable, predicted by every serious tradition, when the entire endeavor appears futile. The vessel seems to contain nothing but ash and confusion. The fire that once burned with purpose now merely consumes. This is not the initial descent into Nigredo, but something more terrible. The crisis that arrives midway through the work, when one has invested too much to turn back, yet cannot see the way forward. Jung encountered this crisis repeatedly in his practice and his own life. He termed it the confrontation with the absolute, the moment when the psyche, having begun the process of expansion and integration, comes face to face with its own limitations, with the irreducible mystery that cannot be comprehended or controlled. This is the death of the heroic ego's fantasy of total self-mastery. The alchemical texts speak of the massa confusa returning with greater intensity than at the beginning. Elements that appeared to be integrated dissolve back into chaos. Insights that seemed profound reveal themselves as partial. The person who believed themselves to be progressing toward wholeness instead experiences intensified fragmentation. Doubt arrives not as intellectual questioning, but as existential vertigo, the visceral sense that there is no ground, no center, no coherent self to be found. This crisis manifests differently depending on temperament. For some, it appears as the dark night of the soul described by mystics, a sense of abandonment, of working in complete darkness without any confirmation that the work means anything at all. For others, it manifests as what Jung called the confrontation with meaninglessness, the terrifying recognition that no ultimate purpose can be proven, that all value systems are human constructions, that the universe is fundamentally indifferent to personal significance. The alchemists encoded this stage in violent imagery, the dragon devouring itself, the king being dissolved in acid, the murder of the divine child. These shocking symbols point toward a necessary destruction, not the dissolution of Nigredo that breaks down naive identifications, but the dismantling of the spiritual ego that has formed around the practice itself. Here is the terrible paradox. The very practices undertaken for transformation can become new prisons. One can become attached to being someone who does the work, identified with the role of seeker, dependent on the framework of alchemy or Jungian psychology or any other map for self-worth. The crisis arrives when even these structures must be surrendered. The double-headed eagle at this stage represents an impossible demand, to see clearly into the abyss with one head, while continuing to act purposefully in the world with the other, all while knowing that both perspectives are provisional, that certainty is unavailable, that the center one is attempting to construct might be an illusion. Many abandon the work at this point. The return to conventional existence, to distraction, to comfortable unconsciousness becomes powerfully tempting. If the work leads only to deeper uncertainty, why not simply accept the simpler lies? Why not identify with career, consumption, relationship, ideology, anything that provides temporary relief from the existential weight? But those who persist through this crisis without either abandoning the work or grasping at false resolution discover something unexpected: the capacity to live without absolute certainty while continuing to act with conviction. This is not relativism or nihilism, but their opposite, a stance that Jung called holding the tension of opposites. The person learns that the axis they are constructing is not a rigid pole, but a dynamic equilibrium, not a fixed position, but a practice of continual adjustment. The double-headed eagle does not resolve the tension between its two perspectives into comfortable synthesis. It maintains the tension, uses it, transforms it into the very energy that sustains its flight. This realization brings both terror and liberation. Terror because it means relinquishing the fantasy of arriving at a final answer, a permanent solution, a self that will never again require transformation. Liberation because it reveals that the very instability one feared is actually the condition of life, growth and creative response to reality. The crisis of the soul, then, is not an obstacle to be overcome, but a recognition to be integrated, that the work of becoming fully human is never complete, that consciousness is not a possession, but a practice, that sovereignty over oneself means not controlling all variables, but developing the capacity to respond creatively to whatever arises. From this crisis emerges the mature practitioner, no longer naive, no longer seeking magical escape, but soberly committed to the ongoing work of integration, knowing its limits and costs. What emerges from the complete alchemical process is not a perfected being but a functional paradox, a person capable of operating effectively in the world while remaining grounded in the recognition of mystery. The double-headed eagle in its realized form represents this achieved capacity: simultaneous engagement and detachment, commitment and freedom, knowledge and unknowing. Jung described the individuated person not as someone who has transcended the ego or dissolved into cosmic consciousness, but as someone who has established right relationship between ego and self. The ego remains as the center of consciousness, the I that acts and chooses, but it no longer claims to be the totality of the psyche. It recognizes itself as servant and instrument of something larger, not abandoning its discriminating function, but exercising it in service of wholeness rather than fragmentation. This manifests practically as a shift from reactive to responsive existence. The non-integrated person is buffeted by circumstances, compulsively driven by unconscious complexes, living according to scripts written by family, culture, or trauma. The integrated person, while not immune to reaction, has developed the capacity to observe reactions, to create space between stimulus and response, to choose alignment with deeper values rather than automatic patterns. The two heads of the eagle operate in coordination. One attends to the external situation with its demands and possibilities. The other maintains connection to interior guidance, to what feels authentic versus what merely appears socially acceptable or psychologically safe. Action arises from the dialogue between these two orientations rather than from the domination of one over the other. In alchemical language, this is the production of the philosopher's stone, the integration of opposites into a functional unity that can transmute the base materials of experience into meaningful existence. The stone does not turn literal lead into literal gold. It transforms suffering into wisdom, confusion into clarity, fragmentation into coherence, reactive existence into conscious being. But the tradition is careful to emphasize that this achievement brings no exemption from life's fundamental conditions. The individuated person still experiences pain, uncertainty, loss, and death. What changes is the relationship to these experiences. They are no longer viewed as interruptions to be eliminated, or disasters proving cosmic injustice, but as the very material through which consciousness refines itself. The new self, then, is not invulnerable, but resilient. Not certain, but capable of acting despite uncertainty. Not free from conflict, but able to metabolize conflict into growth. Not finished, but committed to ongoing transformation. Not perfect, but whole, which means integrated, including shadow, including weakness, including the irreducible mystery at the core of existence. This person carries both heads of the eagle in conscious awareness. They can engage the world with solar clarity, pursuing goals, making discriminations, exercising will, while simultaneously maintaining lunar receptivity to the dimensions of experience that cannot be controlled or fully understood. They live in the tension between knowing and not knowing, between autonomy and relationship, between self-assertion and self-transcendence. The practical result is a life characterized not by dramatic external transformation, but by subtle internal shifts that accumulate into fundamental reorientation. The person stops seeking happiness as a permanent state and instead cultivates the capacity for meaning-making. They stop demanding that reality conform to their preferences and instead develop the creativity to respond to reality as it is. They stop identifying themselves through external achievements or others' opinions and instead ground identity in the ongoing practice of self-examination and integration. This is the science of inner royalty, not escape from the human condition, but the full inhabiting of it with awareness, purpose, and an earned dignity that requires no external validation because it arises from the achievement of internal coherence. The eagle's two heads gaze in opposite directions, not to see different worlds, but to perceive the same reality from the only vantage point that reveals its depth. The axis you construct in the forge of your own sustained attention is the only throne that cannot be taken from you.